Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Dr. Paul Countenance, naturopathic physician, practitioner of Chinese medicine, and former professor of naturopathic medicine in Portland, Oregon. And welcome back to my series, or this early part of the series, on salutogenic terrain medicine. Before I go on, I'd just like to say if you like this content and want to hear more, feel free to subscribe. And I think there's a little notification bell you need to also tap on to be sure that you get any updates to new videos I'll be posting here. And then if you like the content, feel free to like it and to share any comments you might have in terms of how you can steer it in the future. So in the last part of this series, part 2, I went over the idea of conceptual models and metaphors that we use to understand nature, and in medicine in particular, the human being and health and disease. That we need conceptual models essentially to organize our thoughts, organize the data that we get, and whether that be from the clinic or from an observation, and make sense of it. The thing about those conceptual models, as I talked about last time, is they remain largely unconscious to us once we learn them. So, for example, healthcare providers going through their training are taught different conceptual models, which then we just take for granted. Different ideas about how the human being is put together. What is a human being? These things we just don't really ask at a certain point, and we just go and work with the details in the clinic. So in particular, the conceptual models, I spoke last time that our conceptual models take the form of paradigms, essentially. They form our inner paradigms, and these are patterns of our thoughts. And that there are two aspects to paradigms. The first is the epistemology or methodology, which is our ways of knowing. What counts as data? How do we work with that? And in particular, the methodology and the epistemology of modern science and medicine, biomedicine, is based in the scientific method. And then the ontology would be the belief system of the paradigm. What is your belief about the world? How does it put together? What is the world made of? Is it made of atoms? Is it made of mind? What is that? And what I argued last time is that many people, when they say something is scientific, are saying more than it's just something that's been tested through the scientific method. They're really saying if something doesn't align with the belief system, the ontology of modern science or medicine, then it somehow is not scientific. And my point last time was that actually you can have a different belief system as long as you can put it to the scientific method you test, then it is still technically scientific. So that was the idea of paradigms in how we go about science and medicine. And many of those paradigms, or most all of our paradigms really, take the form of metaphors, or we take simpler experiences in nature and we essentially apply them to more complex phenomena, such as understanding the life activities or consciousness activities in a human being. And so our paradigms are based in metaphors. They're metaphorical. And I mentioned the work of Lakoff and Johnson, their book, The Metaphors We Live By, published in the 1980s, where they gave an extensive analysis of this idea that we think in terms of metaphors, and we're usually unconscious of those metaphors. So they gave the example, for example, of a debate. We can look at an argument or a debate as based in warfare. So, for example, we fight another in our debate, we try to win the debate and so forth. Or we can look at argument or debate as a dance where we exchange ideas. There's no winning or losing. It's basically trying to arrive at new understanding and new knowledge. So based on our metaphors and the ones we use, it's going to cause us to think and act differently. And I was arguing last time that in medicine, we have a lot of these inbuilt metaphors, in particular in modern medicine, the metaphor of warfare, which I'll briefly touch on again. And that these metaphors steer how we do research, how we teach, how we even draw pictures of the human being. All these are influenced by those metaphors. So going back to modern medicine, or so-called biomedicine, essentially, again, the epistemology is based in the scientific method, and we extend that in medicine into something called evidence-based medicine, EBM. And evidence-based medicine is where we set up trials, different types of trials, the best one being a randomized controlled trial, and then we can do reviews on many randomized controlled trials, or do what are called observational studies, longitudinal studies, and so forth. So these are all ways that we can gather evidence in the clinic, and then, of course, before that in the lab, And through animal studies and even basic science studies, we have a whole chain of evidence that we can gather. So this forms the foundation of the epistemological method of biomedicine. Now, if we look at what is measured in all of these different trials and so forth, we're trying to collect usually quantitative data of some sort. It could be numbers, it could be values, it could also be what's called categorical. Did a person get better or not? Did they meet this criteria or not? Did they die or they survive? So basically we take all that data and through statistical thinking we make sense of it and we see if our, for example, hypotheses are confirmed or not. So we can say that the epistemology of modern science is really based in quantitative thinking. It's also very substance-oriented and spatially oriented. So we're looking at structures in space usually, things we can measure, biomarkers, radiologic evidence, that sort of thing. As I mentioned last time, if we take a deeper look at modes of knowing, we can apply this idea of the Greek 4 elements, really, earth, water, air, and fire, as 4 modes of knowing, and say the type of knowing that the modern biomedical professional uses is based in earth consciousness. And the ancient Greeks would have said, well, that's great, but you're missing 3/4 of what's possible. So I'll go into that here in just a bit. Another aspect of quantitative thinking is very binary. So a lot of our computer science, information sciences is based in this kind of digital way of thinking. And so that is another aspect of the epistemological method, basis of modern medicine or biomedicine. Now, I said that there's also, in addition to the epistemology, an ontology or belief system embedded in modern medicine, and that is based in what philosophers call, or some call, metaphysical naturalism, or just naturalism. The idea that really only the physical material world is what's there and what's important. So the first premise of metaphysical naturalism, as I went over last time, is physicalism or materialism, that only matter in physical energies like gravity and electromagnetism and the strong and weak nuclear forces, only those are real. And that things like vital forces and soul and spirit and mind really are products of the matter. So this is the idea of what's called the neurocorrelates of consciousness, that basically are consciousness activities, sensations, desires, feelings, our thoughts, that these all arise from our nerve cells, our neurons, through complex interactions. No one knows how, but that's where the assumption is. Somehow we'll explain it, and some philosophers have actually called that the so-called hard problem of consciousness. How does consciousness arise from, which is immaterial, arise from something material? The easy problem, or so-called easy problem of consciousness, is working out the nerve pathways and things like that connected to different experiences. But the hard problem is, well, how do those nerve pathways and activities actually lead to consciousness? Still an unanswered question, but many philosophers have said, well, we'll just figure it out eventually. They're basing their perspective on metaphysical naturalism, that's what counts, is the material aspect, and everything else is a product of that. The second premise of metaphysical naturalism is reductionism, that we can reduce something, for example, the human being, down to molecular biology and genetics, and understanding disease and health at that level will then give us a picture of the whole. That's where the majority of our research and emphasis is going, that we can use a bottom-up sort of causation to understand that. That notion of causation is very important in medicine, and depending on what your level of causation is, you're going to use different therapies and different approaches. So if you're at a molecular biology genetics level, biochemical pathway level, you're going to think differently than thinking at the organ level or at the whole human being level, and that's going to be a very important thing I want to touch on as we go here. And the third aspect of metaphysical naturalism is mechanism, which in biology and medicine is usually classical mechanism. In other words, push-pull kind of interactions. A molecule bumps into another molecule, the right shape is aligned, and then it causes a change downstream in a chemical pathway, intracellular signaling, and maybe gene expression, etc. So these kind of linear mechanistic models, very much like classical physics, where you have billiard balls bouncing one into another, that is the idea of mechanism. A little extension of that is that we do realize, even in conventional biomedical thinking, the existence of, for example, the role of bioelectricity and inner fields bioelectric and bioelectromagnetic fields in the body. But those fields, electromagnetic fields, are still what we call classical fields. They are known as centric fields, where the field originates from a charged particle and goes out, and as it gets further from the particle, the action dissipates with the distance, according to the so-called inverse square law. So basically, this is a classical field, and that's going to be important to touch on because a lot of people want to associate life energies and vital energies with these classical fields, but there's a lot of interesting emerging research that actually you need fields may very well be the organizing principle of biology, but the fields are not classical fields. They are what we might call quantum fields or non-centric fields, and that's a very big topic that will be important to touch on. The fourth sort of premise of the metaphysical naturalism as applied to medicine is the idea of the pathogenic cellular model of disease, which I went over, that we focus on the cell and we focus on the mechanisms of disease. So usually we think of a pathogenic agent like a germ or a toxin or radiation or stress hormones affecting a cell, which then there's a whole slew of responses that are elicited that cause damage to the cell and to tissues. And so these would be the pathogenic mechanisms of disease. And so then we look at, for example, inflammation, oxidation, tumor formation, fibrosis, sclerosis, and how can we inhibit that with different therapies? And that's the so-called anti-approach. So we try to do an anti-inflammatory, anti-hypertensive, and so forth. And that stops, in some cases, to some degree, the process. As we well know, with time, usually there are other mechanisms that come in that we then have to deal with. And so it's a never-ending game of whack-a-mole in a way where you're trying to knock these mechanisms down. And but this is the basic thinking of what drives a lot of biomedical research. And the idea now is to develop more targeted therapies to do that. Okay, so that's the four sort of premises: physicalism and materialism, reductionism, classical mechanism, and the pathogenic cellular model of disease. And the conceptual metaphor, as I talked about last time, is very much based in warfare. So we see disease as an enemy that we need to fight with these, again, increasingly precise and targeted therapies. The question that arises, the entire healthcare system is primarily based in that warfare kind of mentality. And we see that really influences how people act and talk about disease. I beat this disease, I'm fighting this disease, and so forth. The thought, though, is that if we might want to ponder that a little bit and say that if our thoughts, in a way, create what we see in our realities, in a sense, if you're thinking about warfare all the time, will that not create more of that sort of environment around us? And interesting to see, we have sort of gone, especially going through the pandemic, we see this sort of warfare polarities emerging of people fighting. We can say that there's a strong correlation with our thinking processes in medicine, but also just in general, that they lead more to a warfare kind of climate. So that's just a little thought to ponder there. Now, again, we can say that this earth kind of consciousness, this biomedical consciousness centered in earth sort of thinking, has permeated even in the natural medicine field. And this is very interesting to see, for example, where in naturopathy 100 years ago, 120 years ago or so when it was formed, basically used a very different type of consciousness. And now modern naturopathy has really adopted the methods of biomedicine and the pathogenic cellular model of thinking. So we look now at natural substances as being anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, anti-hypertensive, anti-diabetic. And you go to a seminar today, you often see that in natural health circles, the discussion around that model. The pharmacologic model, which I discussed in the first part of the series just briefly, based on the idea of physical substances causing the effects in the body. So, for example, the molecules in herbs or natural compounds causing the effect in the body. That is, again, permeated how we think about herbal medicines and so forth. We think of them in terms of their chemistry now and their molecules, versus maybe that there's other information that the herbs are giving a person when taken that we're maybe missing. More subtle kinds of aspects going on here. Big emphasis now in natural health circles on cellular nutrition. Again, just an extension of that pathogenic cellular model. And now, instead of maybe a half dozen mechanisms of disease, which are typical in biomedical circle of discussion, we now have maybe 24 different mechanisms of disease, from methylation defects to problems with telomere length to autophagy issues. All these different things now are being discussed as just additional targets, not so much for drug therapy in the natural medicine circles, but for nutritional therapy. So nutritional nutrigenomics and these things have become really popular. But again, in terms of thinking, this is all just an extension of the same Earth-centric way of knowing. Okay, so that's a summary of that biomedical way of knowing. The question is, well, what are our options if we develop this salutogenic terrain models I discussed in the first couple parts of the series? We have to maybe go beyond that Earth-centric thinking and ask, okay, are there other modes of knowing? And I introduced this last time. The sources of inspiration for me in this has been largely the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner, who based a lot of his early work on the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe is really known as sort of the Shakespeare of Germany, but Goethe really was interested, in addition to being a writer and a poet and a statesman and all these other things, Goethe had an interest in the then developing field of science. They called that natural philosophy at the time, in the late early 1800s when Goethe was active. And Goethe really was alarmed that scientific thinking was becoming more and more Earth-centered. He didn't use that exact terminology, but basically that's what he was implying, was that we were looking at phenomena too analytically and missing the bigger pictures, which he as a poet had instinctive sort of intuitions about. And he tried to articulate, how could we develop a different way of doing science and ultimately medicine based on these ways of thinking. The school of phenomenology in the early 20th century also discussed these sorts of additional ways of knowing that extend us beyond the analytical, intellectual type of consciousness. Now, if you apply those ways of knowing to the human being and to nature, you begin to see that a different sort of ontology, belief system can develop. And you begin to see more this idea that maybe matter is not the foundation of everything, that what we might call consciousness and mind in different aspects of mind, different levels of mind, essentially are what is more fundamental than matter itself. And again, I introduced that idea of the Greek 4 elements. This is not original to me, Rudolf Steiner and many others. A book I should have mentioned last time is the writer Nigel Hoffman has a nice book on Goethe's artistic stages. So he looked at the work of Goethe and other phenomenologists like Bachelard, and he basically summarized this in terms of the Greek 4 elements. So that's a very instructive book here. I'll put that in the links below. But basically, the 4 Greek elements, earth, water, air, fire, again, we can link to modes of consciousness. So earth would be our current analytical, intellectual thinking, very much based in substances, statistical thinking, quantitative thinking, spatial. So we look at the corpse, but in the clinic, we look at biomarkers, molecular spatial things, physical things, and then we look at imaging. And often patients, when they're ill, they want to know, well, where is my illness? Show me on a picture, show me in an image or a blood marker. And then people are satisfied. Okay, well, that explains it. But as practitioners well know, the majority of illnesses that bring patients to a clinic are more functional in nature, and we usually never find any sort of physical biomarker or change in imaging to go along with the patient's experience. There's an illness process going on, there's something happening, but we can't find physical ideas around that. But earth thinking would very much try to find those pieces. Steiner called that intellectual thinking, and this is what we might say is how the mineral world works. When we look at how we put pieces together like Lego blocks, that's really how crystals form and minerals form. One atom is added to another and we form these structures. And from that knowledge of how atoms connect, we can explain crystals very well. We can understand their inner structure and so forth. So earth thinking is very good for understanding the mineral world. And again, we can look at a corpse, human corpse, where the life and consciousness and everything else is gone, and look at that from the perspective of earth. And that was really in the European Renaissance, people like Da Vinci And others, really started looking at corpses. They started looking at the physical things, teasing apart nerves from muscle and blood vessels, and giving us a new perspective based on earth thinking, where historically a lot of traditional medicines weren't as interested in the intricacies of anatomy. They were interested in more what we might call higher order processes, which I will talk about here next. So then the second phase of consciousness would be water thinking, and this is really process-oriented thinking. And so thinking in terms of rhythms, waves, relationships, polarity. This is more qualitative versus quantitative thinking. And it's also looking at the time element, thinking in terms of time, not so much in terms of space. We can say water thinking examines more the background versus the foreground. So the foreground would be like looking at the cell, the background would be the environment of the cell. And then the water processes tend to connect everything together in a certain way. So that's that relational kind of thinking. Steiner, based on the work of Goethe, called this imaginative perception. And imaginative thinking. Imaginative thinking, we think more in terms of pictures, not static, linear kind of diagrams and so forth. So that's imaginative cognition. And this allows us to perceive things in time, but particularly the life activities. If we look at life, it's not so much based in substances, it's based in the rhythmical element, for example, the rhythms, the chronobiology of the body and so forth, and I will discuss that here in a little bit. Might say that this is thinking more like not a mineral, but a plant. Interestingly, understanding the mineral composition of a plant, all of its phosphorus and nitrogen and sulfur and carbon and so forth, is not enough to understand how the plant forms, what the life cycle of the plant will be. We can't predict, just based on a knowledge of those underlying chemical elements, what the plant's going to look like. You can do that with a mineral, but you can't do that with a plant. So there's a higher order. In other words, there's some activities that take all of the phosphorus and the nitrogen and the sulfur, and they bring it to a higher level of expression. And so that's this more water thinking that can grasp those kind of activities. So thinking like a plant. In fact, that's the name of an interesting book by Craig Holdridge, which again I'll reference below. The third mode of consciousness would be air consciousness or feeling thinking. And this is also feeling. If we think about feelings, we think about usually what we might call antipathy and sympathy. We sympathize and connect, sort of expand into something, or we retract and withdraw. That's more antipathy. So this is more thinking in terms of gestures. When you listen to a piece of music, you're not analyzing. I mean, you could analyze all the individual notes, but you're looking at the overall themes and the gestures. And that is more air thinking, or what Steiner called inspirative thinking, based on sort of the feeling, inspiration we get when we, for example, listen to music. So this is perception of feeling states. And what's interesting, that Steiner made the correlation that, interestingly, this is what we experience when we work with animals. There's a feeling interaction there, very different than the interaction you get working with plants. So, an animal has a mineral body. It has the life activities like a plant, but it also has this third element that essentially we can grasp through the air cognition. And this is really, when you think of gestures and whatnot, you're thinking beyond space and time. There's something more universal about that. And then the fourth mode of knowing would be the fire warmth consciousness, or what Steiner called intuitional thinking. Some call this thinking with the heart, but it's really connecting directly, almost in a merging of warmth with what you're observing, and there's no intellectual in between. You have this moment of knowing, almost like in a poem. You read a poem, and there's this moment of understanding that comes over you. But also when meeting a person, there's often using warmth knowing, we tend to arrive at a higher understanding. And this allows the perception of even more subtle phenomena in nature, beyond even feeling, but more like subtle thoughts, the organizing thoughts or archetypes of nature. Again, this is a big discussion. Do those archetypes, are they just products of matter, like a materialist would say, or are they there that we're perceiving from a different space? And historically, it's been perceived that there are 12 fundamental archetypes that organize the human being. And then 7 archetypes that organize our life activities, and they correlate with the cosmos, in a sense, with the so-called zodiacal wheel, and then the 7 classical planets and their rhythms. So if we look at our actual structures, it was historically thought that our shape of the body, the head, relates to these forces that emanate from Aries, and the back from Libra, and so forth, versus the life activities of the sun, one of the planets in a way, or this part of the solar system, is related to the rhythms of circulation and so forth. And so this idea of the archetypal thinking is something you grasp through the fire warmth consciousness. Now, when you apply these 4 modes of knowing, you essentially extend epistemology, and that gives you that there, new insights into nature. But when you apply this to the human being, we find that there are 4 levels of organization that are very distinct in human beings. 4 what we might call bodies. They each have their own internal lawfulness, their own sort of organization. And what's interesting, again, is that modern medicine, biomedicine, is focusing on only one of those 4, which is the corpse body, the end. And when we look at all the marvelous biochemistry and understanding whatnot that we have, it's largely come from just killing living things, dissecting them into pieces, and then reformulating that into what we think might be the whole. So all those pictures in biochemistry books and physiology books are really abstractions taken from essentially killing things and then abstracting from that, taking the parts out and looking how they might fit together. So this is, again, one of the limits of biomedicine, is that it's only able to grasp that earth level of thinking. So this allows us then to create an extended ontology, and that's the basis of many traditional medicines. And this is a key point that I have found, for example, as a professor of naturopathic medicine, teaching also Chinese medicine and many other sorts of so-called complementary medical disciplines, is that we can't use earth thinking to understand these other types of traditional medicines fully. Certainly they have an earth aspect, but for example, many traditional medicines like traditional Chinese medicine or classical Chinese medicine and Ayurveda really were our so-called humoral medicines. They were based more in fluid thinking, water thinking. And so you need to use a fluidic type of consciousness to understand what they were talking about. If you try to reduce it to earth consciousness, solid consciousness, then you miss the picture. And this is, I think, the biggest issue with so-called integrative medicine, is we're bringing all these different traditions together in a hodgepodge, but primarily using the filter of earth thinking without recognizing that all these others need different modes of cognition. Now, the last point I want to cover here, and this will be the topic for several future lectures here, is again the idea when we apply the 4 modes of knowing to the human being, earth, water, air, fire, modes of consciousness, we find that there are these 4 different levels of organizations and 4 bodies. And this is what I want to kind of review now. Now, this information comes largely, again, from the work of Rudolf Steiner, who helped inspire what is now called anthroposophical medicine. Steiner was not a medical doctor. He had a PhD, but he inspired medical doctors to develop these ideas. And the idea was, again, not to replace biomedicine, but to extend it, which is often why it's referred to as anthroposophically extended medicine. And in Europe in particular, they require, if someone is practicing anthroposophic medicine, that they have a biomedical training and degree first, medical doctor and so forth. And so this is the idea that we need that foundation first, and then we can extend it. So you need earth cognition first, and then you can move into water, air, and fire cognition. And that, again, gives you different insight in different dimensions into the human being. Steiner went as far as to argue that we can create a spiritual science if you include all 4 of these modes of cognition and then apply them to nature and the human being. So if we, again, start with the human body and apply earth mode, we get the corpse, basically. We get our physical form, what can be weighed, sorted, measured. That's our anatomy, our structure, the basis of modern medicine. You go to medical school, and the first thing you start doing is memorizing all the different structures, where they are, and so forth. And so that, we might say, gives us, earth cognition gives us our mineral body. Now, fluid cognition would perceive our fluid body. Now, we usually think of fluid, people think, oh, water, H2O. That's applying earth thinking to water. Water is much more than H2O. It has all these interesting properties. It has waves and rhythms. If you dissolve something in water, it's no longer separated. It's sort of part of a continuum now. And if we look at the human being, we are mostly water. In fact, when we're born, we're 80% plus water, and then as we age, we dry out more, maybe up to 60, 65% water. But basically, the majority of our body weight and everything is water. This water is not just like the water in a glass of water, it's actually highly organized. It's structured. So we have the water in our blood, of course, in our lymph, but then the water inside of our cells, the so-called intracellular water, and then extracellular water. And that water is highly bound to different proteins, and so it forms layers of water which have a gel-like consistency. And there is a fairly well-known researcher at the University of Washington, Gerald Pollack, who now has written several books on what he calls the fourth phase of water, which is between solid and liquid. It's semi-crystalline. And that is the type of water we have mostly in our bodies. And that water takes on all sorts of interesting properties, which would be the topic for a whole separate lecture. For example, it can store charge. And that charge is actually amplified by exposure to infrared light. And this charge drives all of our biochemistry in a certain way. So that I think deserves a whole separate discussion. But basically, to have life activities, you have to dissolve molecules and whatnot in water. And if you really trace it back, for example, in embryology, you find that all of our solid structures, even the heart, is formed from fluid. In other words, the streaming of fluid in, for example, the primitive circulatory system, cells from that streaming start to accumulate along the sides of that streaming, and they start forming the chambers of the heart and the blood vessels. So what is solid in us is actually formed from the fluid. In fact, what we think of as most solid, our bone, really doesn't become solid until after birth in many parts of the body. It remains fluid cartilaginous. And so even the most solid structures started off as collagen, which is mostly water. And so the water is something we've neglected. We look at the molecules in the water, the collagen and everything else. But what about the water itself? And that's, again, using fluid thinking to look at the background, not the foreground. So this idea of water structuring everything, even the enzymes and proteins of the body fold according to the water, and according to what's happening in the water, changes in the water structures that can change the activity of enzymes and your chemistry, even gene expression. So very important to look at the water and its role in the body. So life activities occur in the fluid, not so much the solid, and they're connected with rhythms. Now, if we look at the fluid element, we have dissolved in there all sorts of hormones and activities. And each hormone changes the activities of the water differently. So there's a strong connection with the endocrine system and the fluid body and all of our life activities. So that is a second level of organization above our solid is the fluid level, and it requires a different type of perception. The third level of organization is even more subtle, and that's not so much looking at solid or liquid, but at the gas within us. So when we breathe, we of course exchange gases, but we also have those gases dissolved in every tissue. And we now know that gases like nitric oxide, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide are signaling molecules in the nervous system, in other tissues, in the circulatory system, for example. So these activities, breathing activities really occur throughout the whole body. Now, that air body is not as closely structured as the fluid and the solid bodies. It really extends around us. We're always emitting gas and so forth in a different way. So it's more of a, it doesn't have the same form as the solid and the liquid bodies and levels of organization. But this gas body really has a strong connection, as I mentioned earlier, to our feeling life. So if we think of, for example, when we're stressed, we hold our breath, the gas body doesn't circulate the same way. When we're relaxed, it flows outward. And so our feelings are connected with that gas body. We're often looking for changes in feelings like depression and anxiety in molecules, serotonin, dopamine, and so forth. But we haven't looked yet, and we should start looking at the gases and how the gas is organized in the body, and find that in depressive states, people hold their gases differently than in anxious states. And that would be, again, much more subtle, but give you different insights into these conditions. Now, another connection with the gas, which is one that might be a little bit more difficult to make, is that in the air gas element, we have the connection with light. And this is interesting, is to ask, well, do we have light in the body? We of course need light, sunlight for vitamin D, but also to make nitric oxide. We need the infrared to charge up our water structures, as I mentioned with Pollock's work. But it's very interesting that we now know that we have inner light in our cells. And this is the whole field of so-called biophoton research. Now, the big debate is, well, what does that mean? When you have a chemical reaction, you release energy, it's going to be partly in the form of light. And so that's just, we can say, disorganized light. But what's been discovered, and this is the seminal work of Fritz Albert Popp and many others, a German physicist, Popp in particular measured this inner light as being coherent. It has structure. It's not just random organized, and it is a sort of communication system cells are using that we're just now beginning to tap into. So cells are communicating much more than just through molecules and even through fluids. They're communicating through light. And this would be an aspect of the air, or we might call it the air gas light body. And that light body, historically, people have talked about sort of seeing an aura around people, a halo around the head, for example, that this is an aspect of the light body that we currently are just not even thinking about, and so we don't develop the inner sensory capacities to see that. But Steiner and others argue we can develop these sensory organs to perceive the light body. And when you do that, you find that much of that light body is strongly connected with the nervous system, and especially the microtubules in the nerves. And so the nerves have much more to them than just action potentials, electrical changes. They are also moving light, in a sense, and are connected with light. And so unlike the fluid body, which is more connected with the endocrine system, there's more of a connection here with the nervous system and inner light. I'll just say one little side note is, the idea of water charges, but also inner light, this connection with electricity. This is actually an interesting field of research. There's a researcher, Michael Levin at Tufts University, who basically is showing that, and his colleagues are showing that the so-called resting membrane potential, the charges on the cell surfaces, or just inside the cell surface, determines how the cell will express its genes, how it will function, and how it will actually shape itself in embryos. So what guides what's called morphogenesis and the formation of shape is not your genes per se, but rather the electrical fields that are organizing the cell. Extremely exciting research, and the nerves play into that. And that's why in embryogenesis, nerves are important for inducing tissue differentiation. And we can say that this is almost like in nature, the idea of air organizing water. The water then organizes the earth. So the air, the gas, the light body structures our fluid body through the nerve activities and the inner light activities in every tissue, every organ. And if you look at nerves themselves, nerve cells, they look very dried out, almost air-like, very long threads, like beams of light almost, versus a liver cell, which is more rounded, fluid-filled, very active in these life activities. So the air-light body has a connection with the nervous system, and then finally with consciousness, with our feeling life. So that is, unlike the water body connected to the fluid or the life activities, the air, light body, nerves connected to consciousness body. So this is something we see in animals again. So again, we say that animals have a solid, a fluid, but also in gas, light body, a consciousness body. And historically, this is what some have referred to as the soul element. And that's a deeper discussion, not to sidetrack here just yet. The final body we perceive using warmth consciousness would be our inner warmth body. And we have all these metabolic warmth processes in the body. Our mitochondria are always making ATP, and there's heat left over from that process. So muscles, for example, there's a lot of ATP production, are very warm. Other organs like the liver are very warm, and the heart. We have a daily temperature rhythm. So we're not just 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. We actually get warmer during the day and then cooler at night. And so there's the so-called circadian rhythm, 24-hour rhythm of our temperature. And we can pick that up on the skin surface using infrared cameras. And so there's an interesting application now of infrared cameras in medicine to see, well, where is it warm, where is it cold, and is that correlated with disease processes? And a lot of times with chronic pain, you'll see there's a lot of cold and then heat around it instead of the heat penetrating into that area. So this, in this warmth body, these heat processes are very highly connected with the circulatory system. To make the ATP and the warmth, you need oxygen, which has to come in from the circulation. So depending on how you're circulating and where, that's going to change how your warmth body is distributed. With the circulatory system in the blood comes the immune system. And this is another aspect of our warmth body, is inflammation, which we're going to have to talk about in much more detail, but there's acute and chronic inflammation. And acute inflammation in particular actually has a salutogenic or healing role. But basically these fever processes, inflammation are connected with the warmth body, and the immune system is activated. And that's connected with our sense of self versus non-self. And so now we're seeing in the warmth body, above the physiology, there is a higher element that relates to our inner beingness of self. Who am I? Who am I not? Of course, there's a lower aspect to that self, the more ego self, but on a higher level, we have to have a good sense of inner self identity to sort of get through the stressors of life and be around others. When we connect with another, we connect usually, we're not conscious of this, but if you really pay attention to it, with warmth. We either feel warmly attracted to them or we sort of feel a little repelled by them. And when you're in higher states of higher ideals, for example, love and beauty, there is a connection. You feel an inner warmth there. We can feel warm towards certain thoughts and cold towards those thoughts. So we're constantly living in a warmth element. We just don't pay attention to it. Again, in modern science, we say warmth is just a molecular activity. The faster molecules vibrate, there's more warmth. Well, that's one aspect. You can say that's the Earth way of thinking of warmth. But if you think of warmth as a real entity, an activity that can be grasped through warmth perception, then you begin to see that we have an inner warmth body connected not just with our consciousness, but with our higher self-awareness, self-consciousness, sense of I, sense of self, higher ideals, creativity, love, and so forth. So this is the fourth level of organization. So in summary, we have, in addition to our solid organization, our mineral body, three other bodies which currently we're not really investigating in biomedicine, but many traditional medicines have discussed in different forms with different terminologies. So we have a fluidic organization, seat of our life activities, connection with our endocrine system, a gas-light organization connected with our consciousness activities, our feeling and lower mental life, and that's connected with our nervous system. And then a warmth organization, seat of our self-consciousness or I activities, our higher mental life and our higher ideals, love. And this is connected with our circulation, our heart, and our immune system. So as I mentioned, the basis of salutogenic medicine based in TRAIN, being based in neuroendocrine immunology, really comes out when you look at the different levels of the human being. The endocrine with the fluid, the nervous with the gas light, and then the circulatory immune with the warmth organization. Again, the challenge is, how do we extend medicine? I've just described these bodies mostly from the level of earth consciousness. The idea would be get into the experience of these. So when clinicians work and they're trained in this in the clinic, you can palpate a person's body, put your hands on them, and feel, for example, there's a certain rhythm in every tissue, in every organ. And this is something you can develop sensitivity towards. And that is an expression of the rhythms in the fluid body. In fact, in traditions like Chinese medicine, they often discuss this connection between the light body and the fluid body, and that those activities are what is referred to as qi. And the very character of qi, interestingly, in Chinese medicine, shows a rice sprouting, in a way, life activities, and then steam or vapor, air-like processes coming off of it. So it's a mixture of the life activities in the air, consciousness and life activities. Versus in Chinese medicine, they have this concept of what's called the Shen, which is working with the warmth activities and the higher warmth body. And then thirdly, there's a concept of what they call Jing. Jing essentially is talked about as life essence. It's really earth permeated by fluidic living forces, living earth. So interestingly, although what I just laid out comes is very highly inspired from anthroposophy and the work of Rudolf Steiner, these ideas are in traditional medicines, and we can look at Ayurveda as well as another example there. So that is idea of the 4 levels of organization of the human being. And this is important, I think, to lay out if we're going to develop a salutogenic terrain model of health, because you need to essentially address all 4 layers to have a complete system of medicine. Again, many medicines focus maybe on the fluid or the air, some more shamanic practices, even the fire level, and then more biomedical practices on the earth level. But a full spectrum medicine would look at all 4 levels. So that's why I laid this out at this stage. And again, much more will be coming. So thank you for your attention. Again, if you like this channel, please feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if you like the content, go ahead and do that, and then click the like button, and you can leave a comment about what you might want me to say or any sort of comments about what I've discussed today. All right, thank you very much.